My name is Ronald Sorini, and I was very fortunate to be one of the lead negotiators in the North American Free Trade Agreement. I served in both the Reagan administration and the Bush administration on trade negotiations, and we're very proud that we were able to finish and conclude those negotiations. After President Bush 41 did not win re-election, I came back to Chicago and worked for Fruit of the Loom for about 9 years. And then since then, I've been a partner in a small consulting lobbying firm, and then separately a small law firm based in Washington, D.C., although I still reside here in Chicago. I think we're going to use ourselves on dramatic.
Okay, good morning. My name is Sergio. I work for Banamex. Banamex is the local associated Mexico City Group. Been with the bank for 25 years now. And actually, I think that summarizes quite well in the history of NAFTA. You know, when I joined Banamex in '87, it was a state-owned bank. Then in '91, it was privatized to Mexican investors, and in 2001, it became part of the City Group running an animal home. So that's
my name is Mateus, and I formerly with Illinois Toolworks, where I had the responsibilities to build the emerging market group for the industrial packaging group and build operations in Mexico and Brazil. And I started basically visiting Mexico in 1991 before the free trade agreement was signed, and had to work through the whole process. And I'll share my experiences with you. Also, I'll talk a little bit about what I see as opportunities. And now I'm independent and live in the Chicago area.
Good morning. My name is Ronald Thompson. I'm COO and Senior Vice President of Shure Incorporated, a Chicago-based firm. My participation in this panel is more from the standpoint of the recipient of the values of NAFTA. As responsible for the operations of the manufacturing, quality, purchasing within the Shure organization, we have a manufacturing plant in Juarez, as well as in the U.S. and China. And I hope to have some conversations and some commentary associated with living in the environment and the challenges associated with that.
Thank you. So I thought what I'd do is just set the scene a little bit for the launching of the NAFTA negotiations and talk about the situation in the late 1980s and then eventually up to 1990 when the NAFTA was negotiated. You know, prior to NAFTA, the United States only had 2 free trade agreements. We had our first free trade agreement concluded in I think about 1984, 85 with Israel. That was more of a political negotiation, focused on eventually bringing Israel in cooperation with some of their Arab neighbors. But you know, it wasn't the most difficult negotiation on economic terms. And then we quickly moved to negotiate a free trade agreement with Canada. That concluded in 1988. A very tough negotiation in certain sectors, but again, we were negotiating with a country of roughly the same level of economic development and structure of the economy were the same. When we started turning to NAFTA, we knew we were getting involved in something a lot more significant and a lot more complex, negotiating with a developing country and one whose economy was not structured in the same way as the United States. And again, leading up to that, as you remember, obviously President Reagan, who in 1980 called for the creation of a North American common market. People sometimes forget that, and I wish that we actually would have pursued that model instead of a free trade agreement, because it would have made it easier for you and the business community to move your goods across the Canadian and Mexican border. Free trade helps and it gets rid of some of the barriers, but you don't have the same free movement of goods that you do, within the European Union. But the focus of the Reagan administration was the deteriorating situation in Central America and the Caribbean initially. As you remember, we had in Jamaica, we had a socialist government that was changed government, I won't say overthrown, and we had obviously the situation in Nicaragua and Central America with the Contras. And so President Reagan came up with this idea of Caribbean Basin Initiative, to use U.S. soft power, engage with the Central American countries, give them unilateral access to the U.S. market to help prop up their economies and help create stability. And that was enacted, as I said, in the mid-1980s. It was a pretty big success, created a lot of jobs in Jamaica and Central America. But immediately, both on the U.S. side, people started thinking we really need to extend the conversation to our big neighbor to the south, Mexico, and we need to start doing something on the trade front with Mexico. And at the same time, Mexico said, you know, wait guys, you're giving all these other countries preference to your market. We have to compete with them. We need some type of agreement. And so initially, you know, the initial discussions, it was going to be a bilateral agreement. It's just between the United States and Mexico. We already had an agreement with Canada. And President Salinas in Mexico had, his idea was that we should negotiate sector agreements. We should do a full-fledged agreement. You remember the banking sector, I think, was nationalized in Mexico in 1982 or 4. And you have the oil industry, which is controlled by the government under the Mexican Constitution. So first, he didn't think he could take on politically a negotiation of full-fledged free trade agreement. So he said, let's liberalize the auto market. There's already a lot of integration between the U.S. and Mexican auto industry, and in textiles and apparel, where there was also a lot of integration. But you know, we had some really strong supporters in the Bush administration, many who had come over from Reagan. We had Secretary Baker, Secretary of State Jim Baker. His undersecretary was a gentleman by the name of Bob Zellick, who eventually became U.S. Trade Representative in Bush 43. Folks like Secretary of Commerce Ronald, who came from Texas, and obviously they're attuned to the situation with Mexico. And then Clayton Yeager, who was here in Chicago for a long time. He was U.S. Trade Representative in the Reagan administration, but in the Bush administration, he was Secretary of Agriculture. So there was a very strong team that said, let's try to bring this to the next level. And again, remember, at that point in time, we still have a lot of protectionist pressures here in the United States. It was focused largely on Japan still. And I think the president was worried. Reagan had to fight some very protectionist legislation. President Bush was also concerned that Congress would turn to looking at raising barriers instead of eliminating them. So we saw NAFTA as a way to get on the offensive, be positive on trade, be offensive, not defensive. And at least the decision on the U.S. side was to launch the NAFTA negotiations. You know, we felt that if we integrated the economies, there'd be more investment in Mexico, create jobs. But also we had to play to some of the fears here in the United States, who were continually badgering the administration, as you still hear today, about illegal immigration coming into the United States. So of course, one of the things we said in Congress was, if we help develop the Mexican economy, create jobs there, there's going to be less pressure on immigration coming into the illegal immigration coming to the United States. You know, some of the more interesting discussions with Mexico actually preceded the formal negotiations before they made the decision to join. They had a great, strong economic team. Their Secretary of Trade was a gentleman by the name of Jaime Sarapuche. His deputy was a gentleman by the name of Emilio Blanco, who is now probably, I hope, he will be the next Director General of the World Trade Organization, but he's the leading candidate. You know, the team were largely University of Chicago graduates, Yale graduates who believed in free markets and knew that the path that Mexico was on was not sustainable. But we still weren't certain whether Mexico would embrace the NAFTA. So we had a secret meeting. President Salinas brought his team to Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum in 1990, and I had the great honor of participating in those meetings to say, okay, are we going to go or not go on a free trade agreement? And that was pretty astounding. And we didn't get 100% assurance at the end of the meeting that Mexico would embark on NAFTA, but my colleagues that I've talked to on the Mexican side, in fact, I had the honor of talking to my counterpart in the NAFTA negotiations just yesterday, who I learned happened to be Sergio's boss at Banamex at one time. He said that they all gathered on the flight back from Davos to Mexico City, where President Salinas said, this is crazy, guys. We've got to open up the banking sector. We've got to modernize our economy. I'm going to go for it. We're going to go for the free trade agreement. So we were very happy to hear in early 1990 that they would do that. We knew it'd be tough because you had the oil industry controlled by the government and a big petrochemical industry that grew up around the oil industry that was very entrenched, very protectionist. And they had other sensitivities in Mexico, such as agriculture and other manufacturing. At the time we launched the negotiations, Mexico had much higher trade barriers. I remember that the average tariff in Mexico was about 20%, but some were much higher, whereas the average U.S. tariff on industrial goods was only about 2%. So we sold NAFTA to as great opportunity. There was a lot of interest in exporting from the United States to Mexico prior to and during the negotiations. Of course, the devaluation of the peso that happened shortly after NAFTA was implemented changed that equation, but at least at the time, strong desire for U.S. exporters to penetrate the market. When we talk about NAFTA today, I do think that one thing that's important to consider is that agreement was not done in isolation, that we were simultaneously negotiating the creation of the World Trade Organization through the Uruguay round and NAFTA. And so we were going around the world nonstop. I think I saw my wife 10 days in a couple of years because we were constantly shuffling back and forth between Ottawa, Mexico City, Geneva, Switzerland. But when you sit back and say, okay, how has NAFTA functioned? I think you really have to consider that the World Trade Organization brought China into the world trading system, opened the U.S. market, and also had great implications on the Mexican economy. Although I think in Mexico, to deal with some of the political pressures that opening their economy to the United States resulted in, Mexico then, pretty sure not before NAFTA, instituted very high barriers on imports coming in from China as a way to offset some of the political pressure. And that in itself created some barriers for U.S. companies, particularly retailers that wanted to go into the Mexican market. So, 20 years later, we need to reflect and see how NAFTA's worked. I think, it was a great achievement. I think that a lot of the problems U.S. industry has faced and get blamed for because of NAFTA, actually, NAFTA helped save a lot of U.S. manufacturing, and that the alternative a lot of companies, at least in industries I dealt with, was not to stay in the United States. It was either to set up some production in Mexico and have your supply chain include U.S. components, or was to flee off to China, which many companies did. So I think really NAFTA did preserve a lot of manufacturing and certainly help the Mexican economy. I still am amazed, in the 2008 presidential election, President Obama basically campaigned against NAFTA. He's embraced it now and I think has a very different perspective of being in Mexico today. It exemplifies that they value the U.S.-Mexican relationship, but 14 years after we negotiated NAFTA, the president or someone running for president is still blaming it for all the evils in the U.S. market and all the job loss. And I guess the last thing I would say is it's been refreshing to see President Obama migrate from that to now pursuing something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. I don't know if you follow that. I think that's going to be probably the most significant trade and economic development to impact U.S. business for years to come. So what the Obama administration is now doing, and their stated goal is to complete the negotiations by the end of the year, is bringing the NAFTA countries, Canada and Mexico, and include Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Chile, Peru, Australia, and New Zealand, and create the Super NAFTA. And I'm surprised how little attention that's gotten, but I think as you see the year progress, there'll be a lot more press on that negotiation. And again, the stated goal is to conclude the negotiations by the time heads of state meet in October of this year in Asia. So let me stop there, and I hope that gave a little bit of a flavor of what existed as we were launching NAFTA, and turn it over to Sergio.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I want to make 3 remarks with you were just mentioning about this remembrance of the trip on that plane, which discussion of NAFTA on the Mexican side was decided. Made me realize that to a very good extent, the main difference that I see that NAFTA created on the Mexican side was the mentality. And this is, for me, particularly important. There was this Mexican president at the end of the 20th century, Porfirio Diaz, who was famous because once he said, "For Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." And once I remember a former governor of the Bank of Israel, when he was told this famous sentence by Porfirio Diaz, He said, look, we are neighbors to God, but we were just having 1 mile of border with the US, we'll be selling them everything. And that was, NAFTA was all about Mexico realizing that the border was not a liability, but an asset, and that vicinity was a major opportunity for businesses. And I think that from that point of view, this very smart negotiating team of the Salinas administration had a stroke of genius in terms of realizing that to a very good extent economic integration was taking place whether we like it or not, and that the best way of really promoting that was to create a framework in which that integration could take place, with benefits for everyone. So from that point of view, the 3 points I would like to make regarding NAFTA is that we are seeing that NAFTA has been going through different stages in terms of performance. The initial years were excellent. After the second half of the 90s, we saw a very important increase in trade flow between the Mexico and the U.S., obviously Canada as well. Rates of growth were strong, and in particular manufacturing, which is a sector that benefit the most from NAFTA. Had a major impact in terms of growth rates in Mexico. Probably the reason why in the most recent years we haven't been hearing that much about NAFTA is because we have a major event in the global economy, and that was China joining the WTO. That was 2001, from 2001 to around 2008. We saw, for example, Mexico's growth rate slowing down to around 3%, 2.8%. And when you look at manufacturing dropped to growth rates of 1.7% after growing around 4%, in the initial years of NAFTA. So to some extent, suddenly it came out of the radar in the sense that in Mexico we were having all the impact of having to compete with China in the North American market. And obviously in the case of the US, the sectors that were becoming important were essentially those associated with services, real estate, and the like. And from that point of view, the growth drivers move away from manufacturing, which is at the core of NAFTA. What has been happening, after Lima 2008 onwards, is that we have seen a manufacturing revival. And all these news that we read in newspapers at this side of the border are exactly the same kind of stories that we hear on the Mexican side about firms becoming more competitive in the region. Now, from that point of view, when you put that in terms of numbers, you will see that growth rates in Mexico for the overall economy are around 4.2% on average since 2008. You were quite familiar with the figures back in the early 90s. 4.2% is a pretty strong growth rate for Mexican standards in recent history. And when you think about manufacturing has been growing at a rate of 5.4%. So we have seen this revival in terms of manufacturing, and from that point of view, I think that we're probably at the beginning of a new stage in which we're going to be seeing a lot of potential in terms of those sectors. There are two reasons, and I want to elaborate on that, which I believe that if we harness them properly, could provide a very important, argument for competitiveness at the regional level. And the reason why I brought all these topics is because these were topics that were taboo back in '94. One is free mobility of labor, migration, something that was absent in the discussions of President Obama and President Peña Nieto yesterday, but it's sort of the elephant in the room. We are having finally a discussion that 20 years ago was off the table. And the other one is energy, which was a major taboo area in Mexico. And when you think about potential for integration at a North American level, energy is a key sector in which we're going to probably see a major revolution. Revolution is already taking place in the US. And if Mexico finally puts its act together and starts to have more rational policy when it comes to energy, certainly we can create a very competitive region. So that's the first point I want to make. The second is that something that we have learned, that it has to do a lot with the discussions that have been surrounding NAFTA for many years, is that NAFTA is not a panacea. It's not going to solve each and every problem of the region. You have to consider that you need to have an instrument for a specific problem, rather than having a simple bullet that is going to try to address each and every issue, in the regional agenda. So from that point of view, I remember that a lot of the discussions initially about NAFTA was how to address environmental issues. That was a major aspect in terms of negotiations. And I think that the strategy that was adopted eventually, in the sense of having additional instruments within NAFTA in order to address that particular issue, was part of a very sensible solution that was later part of U.S. and Mexican trade policy, in the sense that when you think about NAFTA, for example, in Central America, a trade agreement that is the next generation of NAFTA, it already incorporates all these environmental chapters and has specific instruments for addressing those issues. In the case of Mexico, for example, a major discussion was the impact that NAFTA could have on agricultural activity in Mexico. The idea that this side of the border, agriculture is way more productive than on the Mexican side, and that the impact that we could have on Mexican peasants and campesinos would be socially important. And you have to consider that when you think about the agricultural sector in Mexico, you have agriculture that is self-subsistence, that is all these small communities, and for that you need social policy, which is a different thing from trade policy. When you ask to producers of tomatoes, for example, a major debate of avocado, they have benefited enormously from NAFTA. So that means that we shouldn't ask a free trade agreement to solve issues that are probably in an ethern realm of policy. What we could have, and this is my third point, is that NAFTA can be a very good framework for addressing cooperation at the regional level on issues that probably are not necessarily related, or at least they are not directly related with trade, but are nevertheless important about the regional agenda. For example, security, which is another issue that was off the table in the discussions yesterday, but again, another elephant in the room that we have to address here. Again, this is something that is not going to be solved by NAFTA. This is something that NAFTA didn't create, in the sense of all this traffic of legal goods leading to traffic of illegal goods. Actually, we were not having borders, we were not having a border in Ciudad Juarez. Then you will have the concentration of illegal activity there. To some extent, borders are the reason why these points are strategic from the point of view of organized crime. So from that point of view, you cannot claim that NAFTA is responsible or not about the the increasing criminal activity in Mexico or in North America in general. But it certainly offers a very good starting point for having a framework of cooperation. And it has to do with the three dimensions I see that are important when you are addressing issues that are important for the region. First of all, there is a national, a national issue that has to be addressed, that Mexico has been addressing. Obviously, we all know about increases in homicide rates. Certainly, we have seen finally a stabilization and a little bit of a decline. There was a point in which we were having around 18 homicides per 100,000 people, a substantial number after being around 8 homicides at the time that NAFTA was signed. Has been declining to around 14, so that's a good news. But part of what you have to do in terms of addressing this issue is to increase, expenditure and enforcement in Mexico. This is a problem that we neglected for many years, thinking that drug trafficking wasn't our problem as long as the drugs were going to the U.S. And this is, being completely candid, it wasn't seen as a major policy priority for Mexico. And we realized that, with hindsight, that we were allowing a problem to still at home. And, what you have seen in the last 10 years is that Mexico is finally addressing an issue of local security that wasn't considered important at the time. And obviously we are paying the consequences. Finally, we start to see that finally the problem is going to be addressed. It's going to be taking still a while to see a significant decline in the levels of violence in specific areas of the country. But certainly you start to see that at the national level, you start to see that there is an agenda, there is a project of addressing this very important issue. There is a second dimension that has to do with bilateral cooperation, and of course this is a common problem. It has to do with the fact that we have an illegal trade taking place in the border, and from that point of view, there is a lot of room for cooperation and coordination between the regional government. Certainly Washington DC and Mexico City can benefit of sharing not only intelligence but also having a common strategy in terms of fighting this criminal activity. And I think that when you consider the governments in the region having a common agenda, Ottawa, Washington, and Mexico City, then you can have an influence on the global agenda when it comes to criminal activity, which is precisely what Ron was mentioning in terms of trade agenda. Is obviously much better to go into the Trans-Pacific Partnership or even the transatlantic negotiations that the U.S. is currently engaging as a bloc with Canada and Mexico. You can have more backing in those negotiations than sort of a standalone negotiation. And I think that happens as well when you think about several dimensions of policy, including, for example, security policy. Certainly, from that point of view, I think that the voice of the region is way louder than the voice of each of the three countries that form part of the region. So these are my three initial points, and certainly looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks. I started to expand the industrial packaging group for ITW in 1991 into Latin America, and that was when I first started going to Mexico, to Monterrey, Mexico specifically. And at the time, I remember seeing Mexico, Monterrey, as a developing country. And if you look forward to what I see today, when you go to Monterrey, you really feel like you're in a suburb of Dallas, Texas. So the growth, the development has been incredible. And this brings me to what I see that NAFTA did. ITW in 1991 was selling into Mexico, basically exporting out of the United States. And we exported a little amount, not very profitably, but we were really not growing. So we decided to set up a facility in Mexico to sell products to the Mexican industry, but they were not requiring very high sophisticated goods at the time. When the border opened, all of a sudden the Mexican companies were forced to modernize and to become competitive or disappear, because now goods were flowing freely into Mexico, which meant that a lot of them had to make investments in their own facilities. So the investment did not only come from the outside. There were many Mexican businessmen that brought money from the outside back into their own businesses to modernize their facilities. And from our standpoint, ITW, we had to modernize our facilities on Monterrey and to add some facilities in order to be able to supply some of the world-class products that were being required by them. So the fact that the duties had been reduced or eliminated for some goods made it possible for us to manufacture in Mexico at a reasonable cost. Before, I think maybe Ron or Sergio mentioned that the duties were up to 20%. So if you had duties of 20%, manufacture with the raw material that already is 20% higher than in world markets makes you uncompetitive. On the other hand, when raw materials became priced at world levels, Mexico could become an export platform, not only to supply the Mexican market, but also to Central America, to Colombia, and that's what we basically designed our facilities to do in Mexico. And we grew the business at least tenfold since then by supplying the Mexican market. This was not a facility that was set up in Mexico to bring back goods from the United States. It was a facility that was set up to supply the Mexican market as we saw it grow in the future, based on all the investments that were being made by the different industries. So one of the things that I saw was that Mexican industry had to modernize, and the other thing I saw was that all of a sudden the Mexicans had availability of very high quality goods, because now they were buying refrigerators, they were buying cars, and the economy started to take off. Infrastructure started to improve, and it really opened opportunities for U.S. companies to set up operations not only at the border in Mexico, because back then there were the maquiladoras that basically were within a couple of miles from the border, and they assembled goods for the U.S. market, but they were very simple operations, mostly labor. Now, with the free trade agreement, companies could invest in Mexico for higher level of operations, and now you saw the auto industry growing in the central part of Mexico, and not only from the U.S., from Canada, from Europe, but they were assembling cars to ship to the U.S. to service the Mexican market, and also to ship to Latin America, Central America. Mexico had free trade agreements at the time with Central America, with Colombia. Venezuela was a key part of the free trade agreement until Hugo Chavez decided to exit it for some crazy reasons, and this was something that U.S. companies could use to grow and to bring some of the goods in. From an ITW standpoint, we built these facilities in Mexico, but our exports also increased because we didn't make everything in Mexico. We had to send things to Mexico in order to supply the full range of products. So from my perspective, there was an opportunity to basically reduce costs and export back to the U.S. or to Central America. But another opportunity, which is the one that we really went after, was to service the Mexican market with the higher quality, higher value-added goods. Another thing that I saw NAFTA creating was Mexican companies started to become less parochial, and they started to look at expanding overseas. All of a sudden, you saw the traditional Mexican companies buying companies in the U.S., buying companies in Latin America, buying companies in Canada. And the managers that we inherited initially in Mexico, really people that had not traveled much, the managers you see today in Mexico are world-class managers that really move around the world very easily, so very comfortably. We as part of our strategy also were able to one of the challenges, I said I was going to talk about the challenges in all this process was, who do you work with in Mexico? How do you start an operation in Mexico? Because you see the opportunity, but how do you start? And we chose to start by selecting a partner that we felt comfortable, had the right financial support, and also had the right people in the organization. But even then, the managers that we inherited were people that we had to train in the U.S., we had to bring out, and they did have the local market knowledge, but they needed training on the U.S. technology. And once we did that, the company really started to move forward. So the main challenge was having the right people in Mexico. And we decided not to bring people from the U.S. because by bringing somebody from the U.S. to run the business, you had to teach the U.S. manager about Mexico. And it was easier to teach the Mexican manager about our products and let them manage Mexico. So that was a key, I think, a key success factor for us in this process. And at the end, it was a good decision for us to move into Mexico. Now, for the future, I still see a lot of investment going into Mexico from many parts of the world. And Mexico has a lot of young people, and these young people are going to be working capacity for many years to come. And the investment going into Mexico, I think, also takes into account the fact that the workforce is growing, it's becoming more sophisticated, and you see companies like the auto industry starting to add, I think in the next couple of years, they have announced $7–8 billion of additional investment, and companies like Nissan, companies like GM, Toyota, Audi, and there's people that service that auto industry that are also starting to announce investments, like the steel mills. The steel industry has announced $11 billion worth of investments on only 3 companies. Ternium, which is really a conglomerate of Latin American companies that bought a major business in Mexico, has announced adding capacity for steel for the auto industry. POSCO from Korea is announcing that they're adding capacity for coated steel for the auto industry, and then Altos Hornos, which is a local Mexican company, also is adding capacity. So all these investments I see will not only increase manufacturing in Mexico, but will add opportunities for American companies to bring products to Mexico to service their needs, to supply them with the things that they need for that production. Mining sector is another one that's growing strong, and that's being invested in by the Canadian companies, in the gold sector, in the copper sector, in the lead sector. Now, one thing I feel very encouraged is the new President Peña Nieto is talking about opening up also, and I think Sergio alluded to the energy sector and the oil sector, which I think once that opens up, will open opportunities to invest in that sector. And energy is an issue because from our perspective, when we set up our plant, one of the issues initially was we had extruding operations, and the extrusion operations, if the energy fails, the whole plant shuts down, and to restart the plant is a major problem. But over time, those problems were resolved, and we had to add some internal generators in order to be able to bridge some of those gaps. But that's an area that needs additional investment, and I think that's an opportunity for U.S. companies to invest in Mexico. And the other thing I see is I think Mexican companies will continue to expand overseas. So there's opportunities for people in the U.S. to work with these Mexican companies and help them expand in the food sector, the construction sector. And finally, the Mexican middle class demand is growing. And we sold packaging, so we ended up seeing companies like Walmart set up operations in Mexico. We sold the packaging to the major distribution centers. Many Home Depot shops opened up throughout Mexico, and I think the trend will continue. So I think the future for Mexico in terms of the business opportunity is bright. I also think that the future of Mexico and the United States becomes closer and closer tied together. The success of one is going to be the success of the other. So those are the thoughts.
Thank you, Bruce. Once again, I'm Ron Thompson, and what my colleagues have been talking about a little bit thus far is the politics of NAFTA, the purpose, and some of the implications. What I had hoped to speak to during my time for the topic is talk about the practical aspects of NAFTA as it exists today for a manufacturing company that is sitting down in Ciudad Juarez. To give you a little bit of history from the company of Shure itself, we're a Chicago-based company and primarily based our initial manufacturing within the Chicago-based area. A substantial amount of time working through various different manufacturing companies or locations in Chicago. In the early 80s, we actually started an operation, manufacturing operation in Agua Prieta, which is south of Douglas, Texas, very small little town in Arizona, or Douglas, Arizona. And then a couple of years later, in '84, we actually started our operation in Juarez. The products that we are producing down there are basically this device that we're sitting and talking into right now, and it's the same one that has been built for about 45 years. There were big challenges back in '84 when we decided to move production from our US-based operations into the Mexican facilities. The initial Agua Prieta, Arizona operation basically focused on phono products, the phono cartridges that Shure is known for years ago. And reluctantly, we still produce a few of those. The bulk of the challenge, though, was this device that's sitting right in front of my face here, which is our top of the line and most recognized iconic microphone, an SM58. There were a lot of challenges associated with that transfer into Mexico at that point in time in '84. Now that's 10 years prior to the NAFTA organization. We started our operations in Mexico as a shelter, but then soon quickly bought our own buildings, basically behaved in the typical tequila process. Border towns of Douglas, border towns of El Paso. We progressed quite nicely. We utilized the labor in '84, and then in '94, obviously, we also enjoyed the benefits associated with the free trade. We do a fair amount of trade with both Canada and Mexico with respect to our sales. We sell our products globally and produce globally as well now. But the benefits associated with that NAFTA provided for us were obviously the duty savings associated with the production that we had within our Juarez facility. The practical aspects of NAFTA really hit us as we started to look at the manufacturing within our Juarez facility and the two Mexican operations. And we decided as a company to expand our production. It wasn't actually because we needed more production space, but we needed to look at other opportunities. And one of those opportunities was to, the logical conclusion in mid-2000 was to move to a China manufacturing entity as well. So Two manufacturing Mexican operations, one China. We decided to shut down our Agua Prieta, consolidate into Juarez, and then split our production into US, China, and Mexico. Since that 2005 time period, life has changed dramatically, just from the standpoint of production that is being placed in the various locations, but also the balance and the challenges that exist between the primary elements. Our major production, 90% of our production, is split between our Mexican operation and our China operation. And the aspects of NAFTA and the benefits of having a Juarez facility has certainly paid off very significantly from the standpoint of our company itself. Going into the China operation, obviously there was a labor cost differential, basically 2 to 1, benefiting from the China operation. Right now we're at parity, and it looks like it's going the other way quite dramatically. The inflation, labor inflation rate that we're seeing in our Mexican operations is typically in the 3 to 4%, whereas in our China operation we're seeing anywhere from 10 to 12%, depending upon where you are. And that's, frankly, for China, that's relatively low. In many cases, you're sitting at a much higher rate, depending upon where you started. But the challenge that I see as we are focusing on our Mexican operation and looking at our Mexican operation over the last several years, the number one challenge that we were facing was security and the violence and the notoriety. I think the press seems to inflate much more dramatically the issues and the problem. That's not to diminish the fact that there are and were violence issues, security issues within the border town that we had our manufacturing location in. But I have multiple conversations with my general manager down there, and you see a press release in the United States, and it's blowing things up quite dramatically, and it's not quite the same thing. Although it was an issue that we, as a company, felt we needed to address. We extended and created guidelines for travel. Obviously, I've got around 400 employees in my manufacturing facility in Juarez. They live there day in, day out. They take buses to the operation, and they have to live within that environment. And then I've got individuals that are traveling from our U.S. operations or our China operations into that facility, and they take a different perspective as well as far as the management and the control and security associated with this. This goes back 2 to 3 years ago when things were at the most extreme times. I have told my colleagues as we were talking earlier that things have changed dramatically going into the Juarez operation. It's almost back to where it was back in the early 90s from the standpoint of the safety level of the violence I perceive. From my experience going down there frequently and having conversations with the individuals. But one of the concerns that I do have in continuing and expanding in our Mexican operation and taking advantage of NAFTA is having the raw material suppliers of the right type and variety that we're required to have for our products. The China market, the Asian market, Taiwan, China, many of the Asian countries have built up that infrastructure of supply to help support the growth of the foreign direct investments. I mean, they've done a wonderful job on that, putting in printed circuit board houses, die casting houses, machining houses, plastics, injection molding. You don't have to walk very far to find a whole variety of supply options. We have difficulty in actually finding that broad base of supplier content in our Mexican location. And that is a constant challenge that we're facing. As part of the benefit of NAFTA, we spend at least half a year every year in preparing the documentation that supports the content qualification of the materials that we produce the content of what gets imported in from foreign countries or from U.S. countries or from Mexico. We do have some supply in there. And we have to have eligibility, obviously, to earn the duty-free status associated with that. But from a standpoint of benefit, over the time that we have been having operations within the Mexican facility, we're earning about $500,000 of duty savings on an annual basis, which is pretty substantial. And as we are looking at changing either the source of materials that feed into materials that are produced in our Mexican operation, we are constantly having conversations with our customers, because if we tip the balance where our content is not quite in alignment, then the duty elimination or reduction is gone. And our Mexican distribution channel, our customer in Mexico, then needs to pay up additional duties for materials that we would be shipping back to them. So from the standpoint of the challenges that we see in having that operation in there, we're looking at, and over the last 3 years, we actually were considering alternative locations, not knowing where security and violence would take that operation. So we were doing many different contingency planning activities associated with, if just in case the border gets closed, what happens? How do we address that? How do we address that going forward? I think from the standpoint of our operations today, as I said, it's quite dramatically different. We're much more content with the status there. The operation is largely managed by Mexican nationals. So we have very high confidence in our facility there, and the interaction that we have between our Mexican facility, the management within that Mexican facility, and our trade associations is very key. So I think it has worked out very well for us. There is still challenges, but I think the comments or the perspective of companies coming back from China is very clear, and I think there's a reality to that. And I think as long as we can manage the environment properly, I think that will clearly be an opportunity for the Mexican manufacturers out in the future.
I mentioned at the beginning that, at the end of my comments, that there's an effort to expand NAFTA to keep the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so bringing Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand, etc. How will that impact, if there's free movement among all those countries, in Chile, Peru, Brunei, I think that's all the countries, how's that going to affect the way you look at your Mexican operation, or would you consider Vietnam as an alternative moving out of China?
Well, given the inflation, the labor inflation rate in China, that's not quite akin to the security concern and contingency planning. But as we look at future, 5 years down the road, that labor cost is a significant challenge. And we are looking at alternative locations. But it is, from our perspective, having suppliers that can be in close proximity to your manufacturing locations is a significant positive. And the difficulty is in some of our specifications and requirements and challenges to the suppliers. So we've spent a lot of time developing suppliers and have worked through that quite nicely within Asia, just because of the significant abundance of suppliers there. Other locations are growing, whether it's Vietnam or Thailand, and those opportunities I think will really be a key in our decision making going into the future.
Could you see Vietnam displacing Mexico, since they would have raw materials from?
Honestly, I don't. I think there's still a very strong benefit in having the Mexican operation.
Sure. we open up to questions, or I think we went a little bit over our
Oh,
time.
no, that's fine. You guys want to go discussion?
I wanted to ask you this too, what do you see, the energy reform? How do you think that's going to impact energy cost of people operating, energy cost 5 years from now? Will it be dramatically lower energy costs for manufacturing?
I think that the benefits will be substantial, but in order to really materialize on all those benefits, and this has to do with what was mentioning, that probably a key issue here is how to guarantee, the appropriate supply of inputs in order to become competitive. Is that, for example, when you think about Monterrey, it already benefits from the energy revolution in the U.S., right? When you think about the cost of natural gas in Monterrey, and you compare that with, for example, the cost of natural gas either in Europe or in Asia, it's really competitive. Now, the problem is that in order to deliver the gas, you need to have a network, right? And that means investing in infrastructure. So if you really want to plan to, for example, move from Monterrey to the west coast of Mexico, you will need to invest in terms of infrastructure. Probably some sectors that are going to be interested in terms of business opportunities is sort of creating the kind of regional networks that are important for either, moving goods or transporting, energy in order to really capitalize on all that. So I think that a lot of what I see in terms of the future regarding businesses and in order to increase competitiveness has to do with investing in networks, any kind of network, whatever it has to do with really integrating the region. That's the reason why originally all the plans were in border, because when you don't have appropriate infrastructure, distance really matters in terms of delivery, because when you have an appropriate way of shipping goods from one place to the other, really the distance becomes more sort of relevant. You can actually benefit from having access to skilled labor that are brought in the central part of the country. There's basics is a very good example. So from that point of view, I think that I would say that energy, and as I said before, migration, given the demographic complementarity of North America, particularly with China's population already aging very rapidly, are critical advantage in say the next 20 years. So I'm very confident in having an energy reform. It's not going to be easy. That is something that is important to keep in mind. We see a very good political momentum in Mexico in terms of this discussion, but certainly it will require, to make a major investment in terms of political aspects. Just to give you some idea, probably you remember that the first polls that were made in Mexico, President Salinas used to be a sort of a poll. He wanted to measure everything. Right? So the first polls that were made in Mexico regarding whether Mexicans would support NAFTA were having 30% of the population in favor, 70% that were against that. And the way that President Salinas saw that was not as thinking, well, that means that we shouldn't be addressing this issue because it's going to be politically unpopular, but rather that we had to do a campaign in order to demonstrate the benefits of NAFTA. And nowadays, I think the last poll I saw was roughly 2 years ago. The numbers are exactly the opposite. 70% of Mexicans thinking that NAFTA was a good thing, and only 30%, thinking it is a bad thing. Curiously enough, a year ago I saw a similar survey about investment in the energy sector, opening up the energy sector, and the proportions were exactly the same. 30% in favor, 70% against. So I think that from that point of view, it means that we are going to have to do very important efforts in terms of, showing the advantages of opening up the sector for investment, for competitiveness. And as I said, it's not going to be easy, but I think it's feasible.
You got something else you wanted to mention?
No, probably stop it.
Question?
We'll take some questions from the.
I consult with a couple of global manufacturing companies that are located here in the Midwest, and recently I've noticed that the talent pool from Latin America and Mexico is being tapped to serve C-suite and senior regional roles in Asia, Europe, North America. Is this a trend that you're seeing as well, exporting of senior executive talent from Mexico and Latin America into the U.S. and other regions?
I guess I can attest to personally doing that myself. At the onset of our startup of our China operation, I basically took my general manager from our Agua Prieta facility and had him start that facility for me in China. I personally, outside of that, I have not really seen a lot of that level of migration. I know that clearly the quality, both the training and the experience that the managers are seeing and have been exposed to over the last 20 years has dramatically improved the capabilities of the managers down there. So I think it's a natural opportunity. And it's surprisingly, just from the standpoint of the culture, there's a lot of similarity between the Mexican culture and the Chinese culture, surprisingly.
Just wondering, from the investment perspective, some of the companies that I talk to talk about having their investments quote unquote trapped, in an Asian Pacific company or in one of the Asian Pacific countries where you can't really pull dividends out or you can't, collect your investment. I was just wondering from a tactical standpoint in Mexico, how does that work? Is it pretty easy to, if you had to pull your investment out, can you do that? Or is it, does it have to stay? How does that work?
Well, from my perspective, the investment we had in Monterrey, when we needed to issue dividends, we had no problems. Or capital reductions, either or. In Brazil, when we had to do that, it was more difficult because they wanted to charge us a humongous amount of tax on that. You could do it, but it was more based on the registered capital that we had in proportion. But Mexico, no issues. I don't know, you're in the banking sector.
Essentially, yeah, it's a very open market. So, for example, even when you think about the FX market, it's pretty liquid. The Mexican peso is now currently the third most largely traded emerging market currency. So from that point of view, yeah, we have seen that certainly from that point of view. For example, for some clients that are based in Asia, suddenly discovering the Mexican market and how easy it is to make financial transactions, they are rather surprised because they will be thinking that there will be more restrictions. And that's, for example, the case with Japanese investors that are usually very keen on understanding, how much of a red tape exists in terms of investment. And I would say that in most cases, they have been positively surprised by the fact that in that aspect, we are really, really competitive.
Certainly from a fuel standpoint, it's a cost center. So there is no earned revenues associated with that. But clearly there is full functions within Shure which address the logistics of trying to manage the revenues derived from that in Asia. Challenges associated with making certain that we have moved the money in the right locations at the right time.
As Sergio mentioned, when NAFTA was signed, there were some matters included like environmental. But as more application of NAFTA has been done, we've noticed more cases of FCPA foreign corrupt practices in the United States, one of them being Walmart in Mexico having a huge issue. And if the TPP gets signed, they'll probably have issues like CFIUS as well for national security here in the United States. Should these trade agreements branch out to include these matters like foreign corrupt, like anti-bribery and like national security when there's foreign direct investment?
I think you're seeing a heightened awareness and attention to the issue. I mean, you probably read about Polo Ralph Lauren just had major, I think it was Venezuela, and we don't have a free trade agreement with Venezuela. So, I don't know, at least I have not, we've been pretty involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. I'm not seeing that as a direct issue in the negotiations, but I do think from an enforcement point of view, you're seeing the United States giving a lot more attention to the issue. But I see more on a separate track.
So they would not be.
I don't think so. I'll check that, but I don't believe so. But the labor environment is here to stay. You know, with NAFTA, it was a side agreement. And it was not even an integral part of the agreement. I think set some good guidelines, but not enforceable. Now that becomes a very important element in all free trade agreements. Originally, you know, forced on, the Republicans didn't want to deal with it. Democrats felt they had to deal with it to accommodate the labor unions, but we're finding more and more companies want that certainty. Companies want, you know, their brand integrity, and they want to make sure that just saw this horrible tragedy in Bangladesh. And so more people have embraced that. That is becoming an integral part of all free trade agreements.
Yeah, this is a follow-up question. If you look at the past as prologue, since NAFTA in 1994, we've seen a mushrooming in the number of country-to-country trade agreements and regional trade agreements, together with the establishment of the WTO. Mexico already has had a trade agreement with the EU and the EFTA. Canada has been negotiating one. We're starting one. And the three of us are in the Trans-Pacific agreements. But just looking at the three countries and looking at individually, Ron and Sergio and Luis and Ron, how do each of you look at how can we better the economic growth and vitality working together our three countries? In other words, what is it that NAFTA didn't do that now we have to continue to do to benefit as a trading bloc?
My personal belief is going back to Ronald Reagan's idea of a common market, having external tariffs. I mean, a big barrier for a lot of people doing business is if you import into the United States a non-NAFTA product, it's hard to move it into Canada or into Mexico. So that, I think the way our economies have developed and how NAFTA's work is probably the time now to consider a common external tariff, not a full common market. And I think that would be great. I mean, part of the problem is, you know, the United States has, since NAFTA, you know, the passage of NAFTA through Congress turned out to be a lot more difficult. We knew it was going to be tough, but unfortunately we didn't have the chance to do that. It was President Clinton who embraced and inherited NAFTA and got it through Congress. We never anticipated how hard it was going to be. So there's been a little reluctance. Most of our free trade agreements since NAFTA have been smaller economies, things that probably a lot of you don't care about, so Oman and Jordan and you know, not major economies. So there's been a reluctance, but also the U.S. has been very strict on following WTO rules in negotiating free trade agreements. Most other countries have not. So if you look at the free trade agreements that Japan has negotiated with China or China's negotiated, they're probably not legal under the WTO because they don't cover all trade and they have major exemptions. So we still maintain the highest standard in free trade agreements. That's what we're going to try to bring into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If that fails, I'd be worried because we had the Doha development round already failed. We're going to try to extend the Uruguay round and have even a greater trade liberalization multilaterally. And the United States stuck to their guns, and I still see that happening. So I think TPP is going to be a big test. But back to the issue of NAFTA, I think going to an external common tariff and common market is probably a sensible next step.
I think that makes sense in the, you know, in terms of that. I see an additional advantage of a custom union, and that's the influence that we can have as a region on the Americas. In terms of bringing negotiations that were progressing very rapidly, you know, in the late 1990s with the rest of the Americas were suddenly established. From that point of view, you know, sort of recovering the leadership of the free trade of the Americas, that was a plaintiff initiative back then. You know, that was sort of regaining the influence of free trade in the region would be an additional advantage of having a common external trade policy. Internally, I mean, at the level of the region, I would say that there are three things that I believe are critical for sort of deeper economic integration. Labor mobility, energy, and infrastructure. For me, these are the three aspects. Again, because the first two were taboo 20 years ago, these were issues that were not discussed at the time, and it's amazing that 20 years later we're finally at a point in which we can start to discuss these things that are crucial for increasing competitiveness at the regional level. And infrastructure is because if you really want to have integration in terms of markets, you have to think in terms of for example, in Mexico, infrastructure is still a lot is changing but with an inward-looking logic, with everything going into Mexico City, rather than having a more regional, more equal distribution infrastructure. So I would say that these 3 points are probably, from a point of view, critical for the common agenda.
What about the trucking issues? That's still,
I think, there are some issues with logistics and the trucking crossing of the border where still they need to be ironed out. I think the unions have a lot to do with it, but I think that would make things simpler. But I think also having a common tariff and being able to expand the markets, because every country is negotiating their own free trade agreements, and now Mexico's negotiating with Brazil. We have a hard time getting our goods into Brazil. I think, I would sell something at 100, land in Brazil at 150. By the time they made a profit, I'd get all the taxes. We sold it for 180, and you were totally you were not competitive. So being able to have that or participate in that agreement by having a common tariff, I think that would make a lot of sense in terms of expanding market access.
I would agree as well from the standpoint of common tariffs. Speaking of Brazil, I mean, our products if sold in the United States might be anywhere from 4 to 6 times more expensive for the same retail of that product in Brazil, just because of the barriers that are put in place from Brazil. The other aspect I would agree as well, cleaning up or clearing up the logistics issues. Changing the tractor of your semi-tractor trailer at the border is a nuisance. You can accommodate it, but you prefer not to do that if you don't have to.
I guess initially this might be for Ron. Talking about the maquila structure, it sounds like the maquila, even though tariffs have reduced dramatically, is still a viable, a very beneficial structure for those goods that really aren't servicing the domestic market. Is that the case? And I have a follow-up question on that.
Yeah, we find that to be very beneficial to us. I mean, we produce, as I said, around 40% of our product within that entity. It goes into the United States, it goes back into Mexico, actually. We don't ship from that maquila into our Mexican customer base because of the requirements of the maquila. But it is viable for us, and I think it will continue to be for quite a long time.
And initially, when people were talking about the maquila and it being labor intensive and really low tech, as I presume that's changed now with just the increasing technology of manufacturing. So you're seeing the maquila actually move into the more technical manufacturing.
Absolutely. I mean, just from our perspective, we have the highest technology product that Shure as a company manufactured in that location. A very significant digital product.
I work with small to mid-sized exporters that do send a lot of product to Mexico from the Chicago area in the Midwest in general. And it feels like, they benefited from NAFTA for a very long time, but they're starting to see capacity for what they do building up in Mexico and also in South Texas. And I'm wondering if that's a trend that you're starting to see, that sort of the supply base is continuing to move south, and how do smaller, let's say Midwestern companies meet this challenge, and can they?
Well, I can talk a little bit about that. I think that Mexican companies want to be serviced locally. So if you're talking to the auto industry and you want an injection molded part that you were bringing in from the U.S., they will talk to you and they'll ask you to bring a facility close to their plant because they're working on a just-in-time basis. Now, from an ITW packaging standpoint, we sold packaging to many different industries, so we kind of had a chance to interact with all of them, and that's a trend that we see basically across the board. So how can a Midwest company deal with that? I think you were going to be forced to go to Mexico, set up an operation next to your customers, and you're going to have to think about Mexico a little differently. Instead of thinking about Mexico as a place where you're going to manufacture things cheap to send them somewhere else, you're going to have to think about Mexico as a market. And what's best for that market, just like you would do anywhere else in the world, and even in the U.S. Are you competitive from a regional standpoint, from a logistics standpoint? And you almost don't think that it's Mexico. It's just, is it competitive regionally? Is it competitive from a technological standpoint? cost standpoint.
That's a question.
Yeah, my question is, you are talking about the labor mobility. I mean, I refuse to say sometimes we have undocumented people, so we have a free trade agreement or called NAFTA. The issue is how you incorporate it. This mobility is totally different between Mexico and the United States and Canada and the United States with the free trade. This kind of prejudice about the border and about the mobility and the integration of healthcare, particularly the change of the Affordable Care Act with the mobility of the labor. So I want to hear from the panel.
If I may, because I think this is a fascinating topic when you think about the sort of the arguments that we have as a region for competitiveness. Because when you think about, for example, Europe, when you think about Western and Eastern Europe, you know, the problem is that in the case of Eastern Europe, although they're less developed, the demographic profile is very similar to that of Western Europe. So from that point of view, you don't have demographic complementarity. And when you think about Asia, something similar is happening because of this very interesting situation that is developing in China, that China's population is aging very rapidly. So from that point of view, when you think about, for example, Japan and China, you know, again, demographic structures are not complementary. You know, they don't have any complementarity. When you think about North America, that's a different story, in the sense that you have a lot of complementarity between the younger population in the south and aging population in the north. So from that point of view, when you think, for example, about the increasing cost of healthcare in the U.S., and that is going to become more labor intensive as we move forward, one of the key issues is that you are going to start to either, bring people to the U.S. nurses, for example, or allowing people to, to retire in Mexico. I don't know, Yucatan Peninsula, for example. There's a limited amount of land in Florida. So from that point of view, when you think about the possibility of migration, both sides of the, in both directions, actually there's a lot of complementarity from that point of view. Think about all the Mexicans that are working in the U.S. illegally, for example. If they were having access to an Afore, which is a pension fund in Mexico, they are already 16% of GDP in Mexico. If they were able to sort of saving their pension funds while working in the U.S. and sending the money back to Mexico, they won't have any incentive to retire in the U.S. They will go back to Mexico, and you will have this additional amount of savings that will probably be used to finance infrastructure. So that's the reason why I think that there is a lot of complementarity when it comes to this demographic profile. And certainly, again, this is a topic that was taboo a few years ago. It is, it is fascinating that 20 years later we are already starting to discuss this kind of ideas.
Great. Thank you. I want to thank the panel. I think it was a great discussion, and it gave us some great insight on the history of NAFTA, where we're going to the agreement and future agreements with other countries. Thank you.